Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are. If you're in BC, it's obviously 10 o'clock. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're excited to be delivering another webinar to you focused on energy building codes. It's really going to be a review of the changes from 2010 to 2020, and these codes are going to be implemented and enforced this year, or already have been. So we're really happy to have Joe here with us. A little bit about Joe. He actually did work in our industry for a little bit. He started out at Olympic Builders, which I thought was really cool when I first met him. So Joe Kasprick has over 14 years of experience in working in municipal and provincial government as a leader, development officer, and building inspector. His current duties include overseeing the building code section with Inspection and Technical Services branch, and is responsible for overseeing the application of the Building Act within Manitoba, including the application of construction codes adopted by regulation, which includes building, plumbing, and energy. Joe is currently the Manitoba representative on the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes and sits on various other boards and committees dealing with the development, harmonization, and application of construction codes. This webinar is brought to you by All Weather Windows. Want to say thank you and a shout out to them. Joe, I'm going to pass it off to you to take us through your presentation. And of course, we're going to have a Q&A. So would you prefer to see questions come up in the chat? We can manage that. Do you want them to save them to the end? We'll leave that up to you.
I'm fine if questions come up during the presentation. Isn't a large one. It's just a very high level changes. So if there's questions to come up, we can, if you want to bring them to my attention, I'm more than happy to answer them as we go.
Okay, then we'll monitor the chat and we'll send those to you as they come up.
Perfect. Well, Thank you. As mentioned, I'm Joe Kasprick. I'm the program manager of building codes with Inspections and Technical Services. For those of you that aren't aware, our division is the branch that's responsible for the administration of the Buildings Act. That includes the codes that are adopted by the province, as well as we do also issue permits in municipalities where the local jurisdiction doesn't have qualified staff to do so. So when it comes to code development, we're the department within government that's responsible for overseeing code development at a national level, as well as drafting the regulations, as well as other regulations in relation to service standards, adjudication process, and such. So with that, I will pull up my screen. Alrighty. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. If not, please let me know, Liz. So this is a quick overview of the 2020 National Building Code adoption within Manitoba. So for those of you who aren't aware, we originally had adopted the 2010 code, and we're in the process of adopting the 2015 code when it came out in April of 2016. During that time, government took the approach to decide to skip over the 2015 and adopt the 2020. So with that being said, this is sort of a quick, like a high-level overview of what those changes entailed. So one of the changes that we saw with the adoption of the 2020 building code is the introduction of a section that's called Part 2 in Division B, which would be large farm buildings. And this introduces technical requirements for large farm buildings. And with doing so, it also provided Manitoba an opportunity to repeal our previous requirements that we had for farm buildings. For those of you that have worked on large farm buildings, they used to be in what was known as Section 310 as a part of our amendments. So those would have been repealed with the adoption of the Part 2 requirements. And so within Part 2, we see the provisions for the fire protection, the occupant safety, the structural loads and procedures, as well as heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Within Part 3, we see the introduction of encapsulated mass timber construction, which is a new construction type known as EMTC. It's introduced and it enables construction of wood buildings up to 12 stories, which could be perceived as sort of a large jump, considering we're going from 2010, where we saw in 2015, there was the introduction of, 6-story wood frame construction. Manitoba never got to adopt that. So we're really jumping and we're getting into, higher rise buildings made of wood frame construction. There's also the mid-rise combustible construction, There's requirements to increase the design option for mid-rise. The requirements that 25% of the building perimeter be located within 15 meters of a street, and it may be reduced to 10% if certain criteria are met. So when we see wood frame construction used in high-rise buildings, typically a lot of the provisions are put into the grade heights as well as the location to a street, and that is specifically to do with firefighter access. Considering the type of construction being used being combustible, you want to make sure that firefighters have access to this building in a readily fashion, as well as there's requirements that are put into the fire code that are dealing with the construction of these buildings while they're being constructed. We also see the application of NFPA 13D, that's sprinklering, that from 1 and 2 family dwellings being extended to row housing. And this would allow for more economical and consistent approaches for sprinkler design. Fire alarm systems is increased by requiring low frequency audible systems or signals in sleeping rooms, as well as visible signals in public corridors, washrooms, and at least 10% of guest suites in hotels and motels. The safety glazing, requirements to reduce the hazard imposed by wired glass. Safety glazing is required in windows and doors where human impact is possible. In assembly occupancy, safety glazing is also required in shower and bathtub enclosures regulated by Part 3 and Part 9. Purposes of that is obviously that if you have glass used in sort of a means of egress or in a space like a washroom and that, you want to ensure that the safety glazing requirements are met in the event that the glass is impacted or busted, that it doesn't pose a safety risk to the occupants, causing further injury. The accessibility of buildings is improved by revising the minimum dimensions of building elements to accommodate persons using various types of mobility devices, and by increasing the visibility, detectability, and ease of use of building elements by persons with reduced dexterity, vision, and or hearing. Requirements are introduced for universal washrooms, shower rooms, for visible and audible feedback signals, and for tactile safety signage. More pedestrian entrances and floor levels are required to be of access. So one of the things that Manitoba has done when it comes to accessibility, previously for those who worked in the design or supplying things for accessibility, all the requirements were sort of Manitoba specific. They were written in what we would call our amendments, which is within the regulations that adopt the codes. And so to move away from that, what we've done is we've aligned more with the national code, as we feel the national code has really caught up to where Manitoba was at, while also ensuring that there aren't trade barriers where if we have specific measurements only in Manitoba when we're talking about door sizes and such. Part of alignment with the national is ensuring that when we have market providers for materials, is that these materials are used across Canada and not specifically just in jurisdictions, which we may have saw previously with certain dimensions of doors and such. Another big one that has come up in the past was in structural design. Manitoba has adopted the seismic requirements for earthquake design and earthquake load and effects. Previously, when seismic was introduced in Manitoba, originally, I believe in the 05 code, the values that were provided essentially were comparable to Manitoba and weren't reflective of actual data from Manitoba. So at the time, it was decided to not adopt those seismic values. However, in 2010, it was under the consideration as the data that was provided was more specific to Manitoba. And then with the review of the 2015, and at the time the Building Standards Board, with support of the Engineering Association, made the decision that Manitoba should be adopting the seismic values as they are reflective of actual studies done by the National Research Council for areas within Manitoba. just because there is seismic values does not necessarily mean that they play a factor in the design of the building, however, but they are things that need to be considered by the designers themselves, such as the structural engineers, but they may not govern the design. So from our understanding, seismic really only plays a role in what we call post-disaster buildings. These are buildings by definition that are required to sort of be in place in the event of a disaster. A good example of these would be your fire hall, your police stations, emergency power plants, water treatment plants, stuff like that. That the seismic, depending on the location of the building, might play a factor in that building. However, it's our understanding that seismic does not actually play a role in the design, even though there is a factor, due to the fact that it is such a small value. It does not govern the design, and it is typically the snow and wind loads that are governing the design of buildings in Manitoba. So even though we have seismic introduced, it still might not be a factor in buildings during the design or the construction of them. However, it's something that we just can't ignore because it is a scientific value. So what we see for solar panels, there's procedures based on guidance from the structural commentaries user guides are introduced for the determination of wind loads on roof-mounted solar panels to ensure that these additional wind loads are accounted for in the design of the building structure. Procedures are also introduced for the determination of snow loads on roofs and solar panels, as the installation of solar panels affects the quantity and distribution of snow on the roof. This has been a hot topic for years now, where panels are placed on roofs that may not have been designed on existing buildings, or even in proposed buildings, how the undistributed loads affect the building. So the code has sort of caught up to what we're starting to see as common practice now with the placement of solar panels on buildings. There's procedures are introduced for the determination of wind loads on canopies attached to low buildings, on parapets, and on balcony guards near the roof to ensure that these additional loads are accounted for in the design of the building. Serviceability, there's guidance from the structural commentaries on serviceability loading criteria, and revised and moved into the NBC to ensure the appropriate load combinations. Some of these things may or may not be of important information to the group as a whole, but I don't ever want to make that decision. So I usually keep in everything that we've seen as highlighted changes to the code in the event that it may or may not affect you, but typically Part 4 affects structural engineers. There's new material standards that are applicable for environmental separators and assemblies. For asphalt-coated glass-based sheets, standard specifications for application of exterior gypsum panels, as well as standards for flat wall insulating concrete forms. There's also air leakage requirements are revised and established performance classes. In Part 6, there's introduction of Legionella. There's requirements for evaporative equipment, and drain pans are revised to minimize the growth and transmission of Legionella and other bacteria. When we get into Part 9, housing in small buildings, the protection of windows, there's a requirement to minimize the risk of falls through windows. Requirements for the protection of openable windows in residential occupancies are strengthened by removing exemptions related to dwelling type and window opening size, increasing the minimum sill height for unprotected windows, and prescribing more reliable control mechanisms. There's also an introduction of home type care occupancies. In Manitoba, we would have referred to these as residential care occupancies, or B4 occupancies. Manitoba introduced these in 2016 to allow for care type occupancies in the residential setting. Through, I guess, studies and works from the working groups, the National Research Council has introduced their classification now of home type care occupancy, which Manitoba has adopted, as well as carried over existing provisions that we used to have for when a building is being retrofitted, so an existing dwelling. So the provisions for a new type home care occupancy are introduced to allow for safe and affordable care in a home type setting. They're similar to Manitoba's previous framework, allowing for smaller, 4 or less residents in unsprinklered housing, but with several key differences. The house must be a detached house, no side-by-sides or row housing. Sleeping accommodations for residents must be on the first story only. And there's stricter egress requirements on the first story, including requirements for 2 remotely placed means of egress on the first story to be barrier-free and exit at grade, or be provided with a ramp. They must have residential fire warning systems rather than the current requirements for hardwired interconnected smoke alarms. The residential fire warning system must shut down the air handling system and notify the fire department when initiated for 2-story houses. Enhanced requirements for flame spread ratings on doors leading to basements and smoke and fire separations between the basement and the first story. The first story must comply with the building code requirements for accessibility. Please note, for houses that are converted into small home type care occupancies, Manitoba has amendments that allow them to be treated similar as residential occupancies with enhanced life safety features. The use of flat ICF construction is expanded to all types of Part 9 buildings with up to 2 stories. Lateral support of flat ICF foundation walls is clarified. Screw sizes and spacings are specified for the attachment of cladding to the web fastener strips of ICF units. 936, which is energy efficiency for housing in small buildings. There's a tiered performance compliance. A performance compliant path is established with 5 tiers, each successive tier being increasingly stringent in terms of house energy consumption and heat loss. In addition, a prescriptive compliance path based on energy conservation points is provided for Tier 2. Manitoba has adopted and enforces the baseline of Tier 1. Manitoba is currently still committed to providing a roadmap and developing future steps in the adoption of higher tiers once proper consultation and stakeholder engagement has been conducted, including market readiness and training. So currently where we're at is Tier 1. But however, the department is still working on looking at what the advancements to the tiers may look like in the future. So sort of stay tuned for that information. HVAC and service water heating. Performance requirements for HVAC and service water heating equipment are updated to align them with Canada's energy efficient regulations and relevant standards, and to add new equipment types. There is the EnerGuide rating system in subsection 39365 is aligned with the EnerGuide rating system, and this system is established as an acceptable compliance path. In the NECB, which is the National Energy Code for Building, which applies to large buildings or complex buildings, typically Part 3 buildings or larger Part 9 buildings of business and personal service or industrial occupancy. The application of the NECB is extended to cover alterations, such as a tenant improvement, to buildings originally constructed in accordance with the code. So in the past, what we saw is the energy code was exempted from existing buildings. However, a good example would be if I had a building that was constructed to an energy code, or say it was constructed to the 2010 or 2011 National Energy Code, the energy code would still apply to that existing building now. Before, the wording would have exempted them from existing buildings. Pardon me, I had to sneeze. So it sort of had this loophole previously designed in the framework of the code that I could design my building, I'd have to meet the energy code. However, then when I went to renovate it, the energy code didn't apply to my building. So you can essentially take your building to less the code after it was built to code, which kind of defeats the purpose. The whole building air tightness testing is introduced as an option, not a mandatory requirement, but as an option for complying with air leakage requirements. Minimal overall thermal transmissions values for opaque buildings, assemblies, and fenestration are reduced to improve the thermal performance of building envelope. Lighting power densities are updated to reflect improvement in the efficiency of lighting products available in North American markets. Lighting power allowances are provided for use in additional exterior applications, including applications not listed in the code. HVAC and service water systems. The trade-off compliance paths for HVAC and service water systems which were complex and not widely used, are removed. Performance requirements for HVAC and service water heating equipment are updated to align with the Canada's energy efficiency regulations and relevant standards, and to add new equipment types. There's a new Part 10 that's introduced to establish a performance compliance path with 4 tiers, each successive tier being increasingly stringent in terms of building energy consumption. Manitoba will be enforcing Tier 1 for the NECB. Under the National Plumbing Code, we see fibrocement pipe and fittings are included as alternatives to asbestos cement materials, which were removed from the 2015 NPC. Other new plumbing materials are added as options, including polyethylene or of raised temperature, PERT tube, cellular core, polyvinyl chloride, PVC pipe, and their fittings. The maximum temperature for water discharging from shower heads or into bathtubs is reduced in healthcare facilities and seniors' residents to prevent scalding. Gate valves and screw caps, which require manual intervention, are removed as options for backflow protection to reduce the risk of basement flooding. The design requirements for non-potable rainwater harvesting systems are introduced to facilitate the collection and use of rainwater. In 2015, the National Plumbing Code introduced water use efficiency requirements for supply fittings, shower heads, water closets, urinal plumbing fixtures, which vary from Manitoba's amendments under the Manitoba Plumbing Code. So previously, Manitoba was sort of ahead of the national by introducing efficiency requirements for fixtures. However, the national has finally caught up, and Manitoba has decided to align with the national. So what you see here would be what the current ones used to be under the previous 2010 NPC. And then these are what the new requirements would be. And then on this far right column, you'll see the variances on what those changes are. So one of the biggest ones you'll see is we used to have a pre-rinse spray valve requirement, and we've removed that. We used to have a laundry tub faucet requirement. Those are removed. Shower heads will increase in flow. Kitchen supply fittings, there's a small decrease, but by aligning with the NPC, it should make it easier for industry to supply products that don't have specific Manitoba requirements once again. When we're looking at the current NPC for residential water closet, it used to be 6 liters per flush. It's down to 4.8 liters per flush. However, in non-residential settings, it stays at 6. And then in urinals, they go from 3.8 to 1.9. That's really my quick sort of highlighted changes. I didn't dive into the sort of technical weeds of stuff, as it's very difficult to provide a code update, sort of keeping in mind. So when we look at code changes, just from 2015 to 2020, and I have Jeremy with me on this call, who's one of our great policy analysts that does a lot of the work in the shadows with me. There was 4,800 pages alone that we'd have to read through of technical changes. So so when it comes to providing sort of updates on what the changes are, it's sort of difficult to sort of cram that into sort of an hour. So that's why we figured we'll give a very quick highlight. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. A very quick highlight of what the key changes are, but also allow us to make ourselves available. So sort of a Q&A if there's sort of those types of questions that either we can respond to right now, or we can provide a response through the WRLA. But thank you.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. So we're going to open up the floor now for questions. I know that some of the folks that are on this call had some questions about interpretations before. I'm not sure if maybe they've had some of those answered, but now is a really great time to start asking some of those questions that may be impacting your team as you're working with contractors or even just on various plans. So now as we wait, because I'm not sure if we're going to get any questions. We usually don't have a shy group. Now I'm fairly new to the world of building codes. I've been in the industry for 7 years, but you're also working on that harmonization Canadian committee. How does that work? And who are some of the folks that are on that, and how often do the codes get changed? and what's the evaluation process when it comes time to actually implement them? What's the process to determine what the impacts are going to be? If there are other solutions, walk us through what that might look like.
So that's a good question. Thank you. So the codes, as we know, are national codes. They're developed at a national level, and that whole process is made up of 300 volunteers that work on specific standing committees. In the past, it would have been overseen by what was known as the CCBFC, which was the Canadian CCBF, Canadian Board for the Canadian Building and Fire. I can't. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
That's okay.
Building and Fire Codes, Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes. There we go. So, and the way that works, they would oversee the work of the standing committees that are part of specific groups and areas to develop the code content. The codes are developed in a 5-year cycle. So 2010, 2015, 2020, and we will see the 2025 codes coming up. So in the past, each province and territory would have had someone that was sat on what was called PITI-PAC, which is the provincial territory and policy on sort of advisory committee on codes. And so we would provide policy advice to the group. But however, the group didn't have to listen to it. So what you would see happen is the codes would come out and every province would go through them. Because they wouldn't see them until the published product came out. They'd go, nope, we're not doing that. We don't like that. We don't. And then you sort of had what we call trade barriers across Canada. So part of what we call the RCT agreement, which is under the free trade agreement, which is this harmonization of construction codes to sort of have everybody using the same codes with as little variations as possible and outlining the framework of what those variations can be, would allow to ensure that you wouldn't have barriers between provinces. Part of that was also introducing a new governance model to the code development system. That established what we call the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, and that would be the board that I currently sit on. So so what happened is the Policy Advisory Committee replaces the previous board and becomes the board. So every province and territory now has someone that sits on that board that oversees the code development system work. But we also report to a policy advisory table that is made up of deputy ministers from every province and territory. So government is sort of setting policy directive in code development and putting their administrative staff in charge of overseeing it. But however, the content is still being made up of the volunteers, which are engineers, contractors, like insurance agencies. It's really all walks of life that develop the actual content of the code. Mm. All the board does is ensure that it's sort of meeting the policy directives. So when the codes are being developed, and what we're seeing right now is the work's being done on the 2025 code. So there's public consultations that happen 4 times a year. So if you were to go to the website for the Canadian Board of for Harmonized Construction Codes, the CBHCC website, you will be able to see that changes to 2022. And you'll see that right now there's currently a public review. And anyone can voice their concerns or comments about public reviews. Because at the end of the day, we're all users of buildings, everybody. And then these standing committees sort of take in those commentaries and determine sort of what needs to happen, brief up to the board. Is this a valid concern? Like something, and if say you came up with, say, a door size, and industry goes, you can't even get these doors. These are impossible to find. Why would they put this in the code? Great place to voice your concern. And then they would have to look and say, well, is this the right measurement? Or do we need to go back and see whether or not we got it wrong, or whether we need to clarify what that measurement needs? And that's sort of part of that code development process. But once the code itself gets published, now the government has to develop the regulations to adopt it. But it should be done fairly quickly now, because the government was now involved with the development of it over those 5-year cycles, and as well as participating in these quarterly public reviews. So by the time you get it, it allows provinces, because now they're not just getting the printed document, they were there during the development, so they know what's in it. So every province should now be able to adopt it in a timely fashion to reduce trade barriers across Canada. So that's sort of how the codes are developed.
Okay. I do see a question. There's a couple of questions. I did want to ask a couple more on this, but I'm going to jump to our member questions. So one of them is, can I hear a little bit more detail on the window sizing updates? I'm especially curious about the minimum sill height requirements.
So the window stuff specifically is more or less going to have to do with, and I don't have the code in front of me right now. I have a dated version, but that is more or less to do in specific areas that were exempted in dwellings. A good example would be you might have an area in a dwelling that was you had that was subject to, say, a fall. So the rest of the buildings in the code, if there's a window that is less than a guard height, it can only open a certain amount, but there was exemptions in residential. So when we're talking window size requirements, we're not really getting into egress requirements for bedrooms, or is there a minimum sill height for a bedroom for an egress window? It's more to do with the window exemptions where the code previously exempted residential windows. A good example I can think of is in my house right now. I have a bank of windows in my living room that are probably 2 inches off the ground and open all the way. So essentially, they were exempt before. My kid could probably lean on the screen and fall 2 stories. But so the code is sort of addressing this as an issue of removing the exemptions for dwellings on where these buildings didn't have to have minimum sill heights when they don't have a guard, or they open a certain amount and they're over a certain dimension. But I can provide that specific code clause to the WRLA, and they can share it with the group. It's just I'd have to type it all out, but that's really what it's about. I hope that answers your question.
Dale, if you have anything further on that, just let us know. And then in the meantime, we'll collect all this information as well, and we'll send it out pertaining to the questions to get the specifics. So the other one is pertaining to the sprinkler system. Does this mean a residential sprinkler system is required for a single family dwelling?
No, that would not be a requirement. By default, the code does not require sprinklering in dwellings. The code lets you use sprinklering to exempt certain. So a good example would be I can exempt egress requirements for my bedrooms if I have a sprinkler dwelling. You typically wouldn't do that. But when we're talking about the sprinkling requirements, those are specific to home type care occupancies or care occupancies, which care is a defined term. So typically we have an occupancy that we're going to use a house as an occupancy, but we're going to put people that are receiving care. Keeping in mind that, if they have home care, that doesn't necessarily mean care. We're talking about individuals that are bedridden, cannot evacuate on their own, you would typically see in a care facility. The code allows for additional provisions to place them in residential settings up to a certain amount of numbers if they meet certain criteria. It's when you get outside of the requirements, the code is going to say you're going to have to sprinkler that. And the purposes of sprinklering are not to preserve buildings. The purpose of a sprinklering is to buy egress time. So that's why you would want a sprinkler in a home type care occupancy if you had individuals that cannot evacuate the building. It allows for additional time for first responders to get there and get the people out. So it sort of allows them to sort of evacuate in place, but it's not there to preserve the building. So that's really specific to an individual that can't take direction to evacuate a building, cannot evacuate on their own. The code is designed in a way that we design buildings in a passive way to protect the occupants. So that they're saying if we're going to have these occupants that would normally be in a sprinklered building, if we put them in a house, we'll put them up to this many people in a house before we're going to say, well, we should sprinkler that house. That's sort of what the code is saying. Not necessarily applying to general dwellings, but it's when you're using a dwelling as a care facility.
Gio, does that answer your question? I'll wait for him to respond. Oh, great. Awesome. So the 5 years, codes change in 5 years. So 2025 is next year. So that's basically going to have another 5-year rolling period before it's implemented.
So what will happen is the codes typically they're a year or two behind. So the 2020 code became available in 2022. But through the RCT agreement and also through provincial legislation, the province is committed to adopting future code cycles within 18 months after they're published. So when the 2025 becomes published, Manitoba, that clock starts ticking. We will have it adopted within 18 months.
Okay.
But that's our commitment.
Okay. So I'm trying to figure out how we could do a better job of maybe connecting, if it's our job to maybe connect some of our members with more of this information. So I've been hearing that there are some folks that are surprised about insulation. Obviously, more insulation is now going to be required. There might be some challenges in getting some later in the year. I know that there are some longer lead times, depending on what type of product you're looking for. How can we do a better job of trying to relay some of this and help get the information out a little bit sooner? I don't know what's out there in this realm, so I'm just trying to understand if there's a role for us to play.
My best advice is to always subscribe to the news releases that are available through the NRC and through the CBHCC themselves. To ensure that you're up to date with sort of proposed code changes and sort of voicing your concerns. The stuff that I've heard with insulation, I think, is really boiling down to a big supply and demand issue between builders and suppliers. And I discuss this. I meet with the Manitoba Home Builders Association once a month. I talked to Winnipeg Construction Association last week. A lot of times, suppliers are going to supply what's in demand. Obviously, that's the nature of the business. But the builders, the code is, there's many different ways to build a cake. So what we saw for years in Manitoba was builders said, we're building 2x6 construction, 16-inch on centers. That's what we're doing. So what's going to be of plenty of availability are 20 bats. That's what's going to be out there. There's an abundance of them. Find them everywhere. The code's not requiring them to build that way. They're choosing to build that way, essentially, right? There's no structural load that needs to have a 2x6 at 6-inch on center. You can build a 2x4, 24-inch on center, but the choice is being made that way. So when the energy requirements came out previously, they were amended to keep construction the same. So over time, it had to change at some point. So this writing was always on the wall. So it didn't meet the 2010 requirements under current construction. So eventually you have to make that shift to how you want to design and build the building. What materials do you want to use? It's great. You can use 2x6s, 16 on center, R20 bats, but you might have to make up for it somewhere else, maybe exterior foam, because the way the code looks at it, it doesn't say R20 bats. It looks at the assembly as like a cake, and it says you're going to get this amount value for the siding. You're going to get this amount of value for the air film. You're going to get this amount of value for an airspace in there. You're going to get this amount. So it takes that all into consideration. It says once you add that up, if you meet this minimum requirement, you meet it. So what's happening now is possibly what we're seeing is that they're sort of now realizing, oh, wait a second, maybe we have to look at the way we designed this wall. Maybe we don't use 2x6s. Maybe we stagger 2x4s. Maybe we build air gaps. So we're sort of seeing that change of realizing, well, the 2x6 with an R20 bat isn't going to work. And so you see sort of, well, there's no R22 bats. Well, no one's going to put them on the shelf if they're not selling. So that's the other side of it, right? Is that if the industry as a whole is going to say, this is what we're going to build and this is the materials we need, the industry will then supply that, and that may change the cost. I'm not a market expert, but obviously a product that's not readily available because it's not needed is going to be more than the one that's being used daily. So, but hopefully with the involvement and little discussions like this and constant with stakeholder groups, it helps us to help your industry be aware of what's down the road, so those conversations happen. And that when it does come into enforce, the market is ready for that and the pricing is appropriate. So
would any of that building that you're talking about looking ahead to what the next step codes are going to look like? And we do actually have a question about step codes too.
Yeah.
So is it because people are starting to build knowing that there's going to be different tiers that are implemented, or that's just sheer design?
So what we're going to see with the step code development, and I'll answer Mike's question with that as well, is right now when we looked at when we went to the adoption of the 2020, which had a tiered approach, we were sort of told in the fall of, I guess that would have been 2022, to go, okay, we're now going to switch to 2020. And we want it done yesterday. So in all fairness, we have to look at stuff and we go, okay, well, if you want to adopt a code, a tiered code, and you want it done now, there's no way that us as a department can advise you to do anything more than the minimum, because we don't know the cause and effect on the market. So the suggestions became, let's start with the first step, put our foot on the stair, and start to look at how we can do this successfully up the next few steps. And so what we've done is we've also sought funding through what's called the Codes Acceleration Fund through NRCan, which would allow the province to sort of develop a roadmap that we could then endorse that roadmap and start drafting appropriate regulations that are reflective of that roadmap. So what you will see in the future is Manitoba working on sort of a guide of what to expect us going through the steps, when to expect those steps to happen, as well as looking at providing subsidized training, essentially, to possibly educators, to allow industry to educate themselves on code requirements for energy efficiency through this fund. So that's the ultimate goal. Can't give specific dates right now, as we're still in the process of an agreement and a contract with the federal government. But that is something that Manitoba is working on right now. And so what you would see is sort of, here you go. You can expect, whether it's tier 2, tier 3, whatever tier it is that they decide to go to, through an educated process of stakeholder consultation, market study, everything else, which would more than likely include groups like yourself with this consultant that we would work with, so that we can then go to government and say, here's how we can get to tier 3, and here's how we can do it successfully based on talking to everybody. And here's how we can provide training to get to tier 3. And here's the date we can give people, so that there's this ample notice as well as support from everybody, because we're all stakeholders in this in the future. So right now, that's why our foot's on step 1, but we don't want to do any more steps until we do this proper approach with everybody involved: designers, contractors, suppliers, everybody. So stay tuned for that stuff. I'm sure there'll be some stuff that'll come out to the groups looking for feedback, whether it's through us specifically or through a consultant on our behalf.
Okay, amazing. Well, we'll follow some of the groups that our members could participate in. We'll look up that information. Mike, can you just confirm that answered your question, or did you have anything further you were hoping to collect on that? We do have a partnership with Blue House Energy. Have you heard of them before? They're out on the East Coast.
Not myself specifically, no.
Well, I'll send you some more information, but we are offering some training on this piece, because we had a lot of members approach us and say, hey, listen, we're a little bit behind on this. And there is a training course. They're offering discounts to our members as well. So I'll send that out as a follow-up to this as well. In addition to, we'll collect that information from you on the windowsill piece, and then we'll send out the follow-up to those links that you had mentioned, which is the CBHCC, correct?
Yeah.
And then NRCan. So okay.
Yeah. So
thanks, Mike, for confirming.
Yeah. Basically, what we're looking at on the training would be that Manitoba does have a group that does provide code training that is recognized for building official accreditations and stuff, and other professional associations. We would more than likely look at partnering with someone similar to that could, because it'd be designers, so engineers, architects, building inspectors, contractors, whoever might be part of that. And it would be looking at subsidizing, saying we have X amount of money to subsidize X amount of spots. So in the hopes that whoever's signing up is getting free training. That is the vision of what we're hoping to be able to provide.
Okay. Keep us posted on that. please.
Yes,
Mike, we're recording the webinar. We're going to post it, send out the link, and I will connect you with Joe directly as well. Does anybody else have any other questions that they wanted to ask before we wrap this up? I could sing, but I'm not going to. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in. So we will send this out. I will include Joe's contact information. So if anybody did have some follow-ups, then they can reach out to you directly. Thank you so much for your time on this. We really appreciate it. And of course, if anyone has any questions for us, please feel free to send them our way. But I don't see anything else coming through. So I think we're going to end it here.
If I can add on top of that, sorry, including questions to do with code interpretations. Just to be clear, because you brought up code interpretations before, the codes are provincial laws. So if you're unsure of the requirements, please ask the province. That would be us. It is our interpretation. Requirements are subject to adjudication that are imposed by municipalities. We establish the codes. The municipalities have the responsibility to enforce them. So there's no that this is the way it's done in Thompson and this is the way it's done in Gimli. There's only one code in Manitoba, and when it's unclear, please ask us.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being a resource. Have a really great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our webinar series, and we'll see you soon.